Digital Fortress, a Thriller by Dan Brown. John L. Nance, the author of Pandora's Clock and Blackout, calls it a disturbing, cutting-edge techno-thriller that should galvanize everyone who sends or receives email or even dreams of navigating the web. Prologue. Plaza de España, Seville, Spain, 11 a.m. It is said that in death all things become clear. Ensai Tancado now knew it was true. As he clutched his chest and fell to the ground in pain, he realized the horror of his mistake. People appeared hovering over him trying to help, but Tancado did not want help. It was too late for that. Trembling, he raised his left hand and held his fingers outward. "Look at my hand!" The faces around him stared, but he could tell they did not understand. On his finger was an engraved golden ring. For an instant, the markings glimmered in the Andalusian sun. Ensai Tancado knew it was the last light he would ever see. Chapter 1. They were in the Smoky Mountains at their favorite bed and breakfast. David was smiling down at her. "What do you say, gorgeous? Marry me?" Looking up from their canopy bed, she knew he was the one. Forever. As she stared into his deep green eyes, somewhere in the distance a deafening bell began to ring. It was pulling him away. She reached for him, but her arms clutched empty air. It was the sound of the phone that fully awoke Susan Fletcher from her dream. She gasped, sat up in bed, and fumbled for the receiver. "Hello?" "Susan, it's David. Did I wake you?" She smiled, rolling over in bed. "I was just dreaming of you. Come over and play." He laughed. "It's still dark out." She moaned sensuously. "Then definitely come over and play. We can sleep in before we head north." David let out a frustrated sigh. "That's why I'm calling. It's about our trip I've got to postpone." Susan was suddenly wide awake. "What?" "I'm sorry, I've got to leave town. I'll be back by tomorrow. We can head up first thing in the morning. We'll still have 2 days. "But I made reservations," Susan said, hurt. "I got our old room at Stone Manor." "I know, but tonight was supposed to be special to celebrate 6 months. You do remember we're engaged, don't you?" "Susan," he sighed, "I really can't get into it now. They've got a car waiting. I'll call you from the plane and explain everything." "Plane?" She repeated. "What's going on? Why would the university—" "It's not the university. I'll phone and explain later. I've really got to go. They're calling for me. I'll be in touch, I promise." "David!" she cried. But it was too late. David had hung up. Susan Fletcher lay awake for hours waiting for him to call back. The phone never rang. Later that afternoon, Susan sat dejected in the tub. She submerged herself in the soapy water and tried to forget Stone Manor and the Smoky Mountains. Where could he be? She wondered. Why hasn't he called? Gradually, the water around her went from hot to lukewarm and finally to cold. She was about to get out when her cordless phone buzzed to life. Susan bolted upright, sloshing water on the floor as she grappled for the receiver she'd left on the sink. "David?" "It's Strathmore," the voice replied. Susan slumped. "Oh." She was unable to hide her disappointment. "Good afternoon, Commander." "Hoping for a younger man," the voice chuckled. "No, sir," Susan said, embarrassed. "It's not how it—" "Sure it is." He laughed. "David Becker's a good man. Don't ever lose him." "Thank you, sir." The commander's voice turned suddenly stern. "Susan, I'm calling because I need you in here. Pronto." She tried to focus. "It's Saturday, sir. We don't usually—" "I know," he said calmly. "It's an emergency." Susan sat up. Emergency? She'd never heard the word cross Commander Strathmore's lips. An emergency? In crypto? She couldn't imagine. Yes, sir. She paused. "I'll be there as soon as I can." "Make it sooner." Strathmore hung up. Susan Fletcher stood wrapped in a towel and dripped on the neatly folded clothes she'd set out the night before. Hiking shorts, a sweater for the cool mountain evenings, and the new lingerie she'd bought for the nights. Depressed, she went to her closet for a clean blouse and skirt. An emergency? In crypto? As she went downstairs, Susan wondered how the day could get much worse. She was about to find out. Chapter 2. 30,000 feet above a dead, calm ocean, David Becker stared miserably from the Learjet 60's small oval window. He'd been told the phone on board was out of order, and he'd never had a chance to call Susan. "What am I doing here?" he grumbled to himself. But the answer was simple. There were men to whom you just didn't say no. "Mr. Becker," the loudspeaker crackled, "will be arriving in half an hour." Becker nodded gloomily to the invisible voice. Wonderful. He pulled the shade and tried to sleep, but he could only think of her. Chapter 3. Susan's Volvo sedan rolled to a stop in the shadow of the 10-foot-high barbed cyclone fence. A young guard placed his hand on the roof. "ID, please." Susan obliged and settled in for the usual half-minute wait. The officer ran her card through a computerized scanner. Finally, he looked up. "Thank you, Miss Fletcher." He gave an imperceptible sign, and the gate swung open. Half a mile ahead, Susan repeated the entire procedure at an equally imposing electrified fence. "Come on, guys. I've only been through here a million times." As she approached the final checkpoint, a stocky sentry with 2 attack dogs and a machine gun glanced down at her license plate and waved her through. She followed K9 Road for another 250 yards and pulled into Employee Lot C. Unbelievable, she thought. 26,000 employees and a $12 billion budget. You'd think they could make it through the weekend without me. Susan gunned the car into her reserve spot and killed the engine. After crossing the landscape terrace and entering the main building, she cleared 2 more internal checkpoints and finally arrived at the windowless tunnel that led to the new wing. A voice scan booth blocked her entry. National Security Agency, NSA. Crypto facility, authorized personnel only. The armed guard looked up. "Afternoon, Miss Fletcher." Susan smiled tiredly. "Hi, John. Didn't expect you today." "Yeah, me neither." She leaned toward the parabolic microphone. "Susan Fletcher," she stated clearly. The computer instantly confirmed the frequency concentrations in her voice, and the gate clicked open. She stepped through. Side note, I recall I've read this book a million times, I recall at some point, I think, Susan, when she's going through the checkpoints, the inside ones in the building, having to put, a Q-tip in her mouth, I guess they do, DNA, authorization to get through checkpoints, but it's not here anymore. Although that might have been from the book by it's like a parody of the Da Vinci Code, the Dick Cheney Code. It's pretty funny, short, quick, funny read. But anyway, I think it was from this book, but maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, it's not here anymore. End of side note. The guard admired Susan as she began her walk down the cement causeway. He noticed that her strong hazel eyes seemed distant today, but her cheeks had a flushed freshness, and her shoulder-length auburn hair looked newly blown dry. Trailing her was the faint scent of Johnson's baby powder. His eyes fell the length of her slender torso, to her white blouse with the bra barely visible beneath, to her knee-length khaki skirt, and finally to her legs, Susan Fletcher's legs. Hard to imagine they support a 170 IQ, he mused to himself. He stared after her a long time. Finally, he shook his head as she disappeared in the distance. As Susan reached the end of the tunnel, a circular vault-like door blocked her way. The enormous letters read Crypto. CRYPTO. Sighing, she placed her hand inside the recessed cipher box and entered her 5-digit PIN. Seconds later, the 12-ton slab of steel began to revolve. She tried to focus, but her thoughts reeled back to him. David Becker, the only man she'd ever loved. The youngest full professor at Georgetown University and a brilliant foreign language specialist. He was practically a celebrity in the world of academia. Born with an eidetic memory and a love of languages, he'd mastered 6 Asian dialects, as well as Spanish, French, and Italian. His university lectures on etymology and linguistics were standing room only, and he invariably stayed late to answer a barrage of questions. He spoke with authority and enthusiasm, apparently oblivious to the adoring gazes of his starstruck co-eds. Becker was dark, a rugged, youthful 35 with sharp green eyes and a wit to match. His strong jaw and taut features reminded Susan of carved marble. Over 6 feet tall, Becker moved across the squashed court faster than any of his colleagues could comprehend. After soundly beating his opponent, he would cool off by dousing his head in a drinking fountain and soaking his tuft of thick black hair. Then, still dripping, he'd treat his opponent to a fruit shake and a bagel. As with all young professors, David's university salary was modest. From time to time, when he needed to renew his squash club membership or restring his old Dunlop with gut, he earned extra money by doing translating work for government agencies in and around Washington. It was on one of those jobs that he'd met Susan. It was a crisp morning during fall break when Becker returned from a morning job to his 3-room faculty apartment to find his answering machine blinking. He downed a quart of orange juice as he listened to the playback. The message was like many he received, a government agency requesting his translating services for a few hours later that morning. The only strange thing was that Becker had never heard of the organization. "They're called the National Security Agency," Becker said, calling a few of his colleagues for background. The reply was always the same. "You mean the National Security Council?" Becker checked the message. Nope, they said agency, the NSA. Never heard of them. Becker checked the GAO directory and it showed no listing either. Puzzled, Becker called one of his old squash buddies, an ex-political analyst turned research clerk at the Library of Congress. David was shocked by his friend's explanation. Apparently, not only did the NSA exist, but it was considered one of the most influential government organizations in the world. It had been gathering global electronic intelligence data and protecting U.S. classified information for over half a century. Only 3% of Americans were even aware it existed. NSA, his buddy joked, stands for No Such Agency. With a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, Becker accepted the mysterious agency's offer. He drove the 37 miles to their 86-acre headquarters hidden discreetly in the wooded hills of Fort Meade, Maryland. After passing through endless security checks and being issued a 6-hour holographic guest pass, he was escorted to a plush research facility where he was told he would spend the afternoon providing quote-unquote blind support to the cryptography division, an elite group of mathematical brainiacs known as the Codebreakers. For the first hour, the cryptographers seemed unaware Becker was even there. They hovered around an enormous table and spoke a language Becker had never heard. They spoke of stream ciphers, self-decimated generators, knapsack variants, zero-knowledge protocols, unicity points. Becker observed, lost. They scrawled symbols on graph paper, pored over computer printouts, and continuously referred to the jumble of text on the overhead projector. Eventually, one of them explained what Becker had already surmised. The scrambled text was a code, a ciphertext, groups of numbers and letters representing encrypted words. The cryptographer's job was to study the code and extract from it the original message or clear text. The NSA had called Becker because they suspected the original message was written in Mandarin Chinese. He was to translate the symbols as the cryptographers decrypted them. For 2 hours, Becker interpreted an endless stream of Mandarin symbols, but each time he gave them a translation, the cryptographers shook their head in despair. Apparently, the code was not making sense. Eager to help, Becker pointed out that all the characters they'd shown him had a common trait. They were also part of the kanji language. Instantly, the bustle in the room fell silent. The man in charge, a lanky chain smoker named Morant, turned to Becker in disbelief. "You mean these symbols have multiple meanings?" Becker nodded. He explained that kanji was a Japanese writing system based on modified Chinese characters. He had been giving Mandarin translations because that's what they'd asked for. "Jesus Christ," Morante coughed. "Let's try the kanji." Like magic, everything fell into place. The cryptographers were duly impressed, but nonetheless, they still made Becker work on the characters out of sequence. It's for your own safety, Morant said. This way you won't know what you're translating. Becker laughed. Then he noticed nobody else was laughing. When the code finally broke, Becker had no idea what dark secrets he'd helped to reveal, but one thing was for certain. The NSA took code breaking seriously. The check in Becker's pocket was more than an entire month's university salary. On his way back out through the series of security checkpoints in the main corridor, Becker's exit was blocked by a guard hanging up a phone. "Mr. Becker, wait here, please." "What's the problem?" Becker had not expected the meeting to take so long, and he was running late for his standing Saturday afternoon squash match. The guard shrugged. "Head of crypto wants a word. She's on her way out now." "She?" Becker laughed. He had yet to see a female inside the NSA. "Is that a problem for you?" a woman's voice asked from behind him. Becker turned and immediately felt himself flush. He eyed the ID card on the woman's blouse. The head of the NSA's cryptography division was not only a woman, but an attractive woman at that. "No," Becker fumbled, Susan Fletcher." The woman smiled, holding out her slender hand. Becker took it. "David Becker." "Congratulations, Mr. Becker. I heard you did a fine job today. Might I chat with you about it?" Becker hesitated. "Actually, I'm in a bit of a rush at the moment." He hoped spurning the world's most powerful intelligence agency wasn't a foolish act. But his squash match started in 45 minutes, and he had a reputation to uphold. David Becker was never late for squash. Class, maybe, but never squash. "I'll be brief." Susan Fletcher smiled. "Right this way, please." 10 minutes later, Becker was in the NSA's commissary, enjoying a popover and cranberry juice with the NSA's lovely head cryptographer, Susan Fletcher. It quickly became evident to David that the 38-year-old's high-ranking position at the NSA was no fluke. She was one of the brightest women he had ever met. As they discussed codes and code breaking, Becker found himself struggling to keep up. A new and exciting experience for him. An hour later, after Becker had obviously missed his squash match and Susan had blatantly ignored 3 pages on the intercom, both of them had to laugh. There they were, 2 highly analytical minds, presumably immune to irrational infatuations. But somehow, while they sat there discussing linguistic morphology and pseudo-random number generators, they felt like a couple of teenagers. Everything was fireworks. Susan never did get around to the real reason she wanted to speak to David Becker, to offer him a trial post in their Asiatic cryptography division. It was clear from the passion with which the young professor spoke about teaching that he would never leave the university. Susan decided not to ruin the mood by talking business. She felt like a schoolgirl all over again. Nothing was going to spoil it, and nothing did. Their courtship was slow and romantic. Stolen escapes whenever their schedules permitted, long walks through the Georgetown campus, late-night cappuccinos at Merletti's, occasional lectures and concerts. Susan found herself laughing more than she'd ever thought possible. It seemed there was nothing David couldn't twist into a joke. It was a welcome release from the intensity of her post at the NSA. One crisp autumn afternoon, they sat in the bleachers watching Georgetown soccer get pummeled by Rutgers. "What sport did you say you play?" Susan teased. "Zucchini?" Becker groaned. "It's called squash." She gave him a dumb look. "It's like zucchini," he explained, "but the court's smaller." Susan pushed him. Georgetown's left wing sent a corner kick sailing out of bounds, and a boo went up from the crowd. The defenseman hurried back downfield. "How about you?" Becker asked. "Play any sports?" "I'm a black belt in Stairmaster." Becker cringed. "I prefer sports you can win." Susan smiled. "Overachiever, are we?" Georgetown's star defenseman blocked a pass, and there was a communal cheer in the stands. Susan leaned over and whispered in David's ear, "Doctor." He turned and eyed her, lost. "Doctor," she repeated. "Say the first thing that comes to mind." Becker looked doubtful. "Word associations?" "Standard NSA procedure. I need to know who I'm with." She eyed him sternly. "Doctor." Becker shrugged. "Seuss." Susan gave him a frown. "Okay, try this one. Kitchen." He didn't hesitate. "Bedroom." Susan arched her eyebrows coyly. Okay, how about this? Cat. Gut, Becker fired back. Gut? Yeah, cat gut. Squash racket, string of champions. That's pleasant, she groaned. Your diagnosis? Becker inquired. Susan thought a minute. You're a childish, sexually frustrated squash fiend. Becker shrugged. Sounds about right. It went on like that for weeks. Over dessert at all-night diners, Becker would ask endless questions. Where had she learned mathematics? How did she end up at the NSA? How did she get so captivating? Susan blushed and admitted she'd been a late bloomer. Lanky and awkward with braces through her late teens. Susan said her Aunt Clara had once told her God's apology for Susan's plainness was to give her brains. A premature apology, Becker thought. Susan explained that her interest in cryptography had started in junior high school. The president of the computer club, a towering 8th grader named Frank Gutman, typed her a love poem and encrypted it with a number substitution scheme. Susan begged to know what it said. Frank flirtatiously refused. Susan took the code home and stayed up all night with the flashlight under her covers until she figured out the secret. Every number represented a letter. She carefully deciphered the code and watched in wonder as the seemingly random digits turned magically into beautiful poetry. In that instant, she knew she'd fallen in love. Codes and cryptography would become her life. Almost 20 years later, after getting her master's in mathematics from Johns Hopkins and studying number theory on a full scholarship from MIT, she submitted her doctoral thesis, Cryptographic Methods, Protocols, and Algorithms for Manual Applications. Apparently, her professor was not the only one who read it. Shortly afterwards, Susan received a phone call and a plane ticket from the NSA. Everyone in cryptography knew about the NSA. It was home to the best cryptographic minds on the planet. Each spring, as the private sector firms descended on the brightest new minds in the workforce and offered obscene salaries and stock options, the NSA watched carefully, selected their targets, and then simply stepped in and doubled the best standing offer. What the NSA wanted, the NSA bought. Trembling with anticipation, Susan flew to Washington's Dulles International Airport, where she was met by an NSA driver who whisked her off to Fort Meade. There were 41 others who had received the same phone call that year. At 28, Susan was the youngest. She was also the only female. The visit turned out to be more of a public relations bonanza and a barrage of intelligence testing than an informational session. In the week that followed, Susan and 6 others were invited back. Although hesitant, Susan returned. The group was immediately separated. They underwent individual polygraph tests, background searches, handwriting analyses, and endless hours of interviews, including taped inquiries into their sexual orientations and practices. When the interviewer asked Susan if she'd ever engaged in sex with animals, she almost walked out, but somehow the mystery carried her through. The prospect of working on the cutting edge of code theory, entering the Puzzle Palace, and becoming a member of the most secretive club in the world, the National Security Agency. Becker sat riveted by her stories. They actually asked you if you'd had sex with animals. Susan shrugged. Part of the routine background check. Well, Becker fought off a grin. What'd you say? She kicked him under the table. I told them no. Then she added, and until last night, it was true. In Susan's eyes, David was as close to perfect as she could imagine. He only had one unfortunate quality. Every time they went out, he insisted on picking up the check. Susan hated seeing him lay down a full day's salary on dinner for 2, but Becker was immovable. Susan learned not to protest, but it still bothered her. I make more money than I know what to do with. She thought I should be paying. Nonetheless, Susan decided that aside from David's outdated sense of chivalry, he was ideal. He was compassionate, smart, funny, and best of all, he had a sincere interest in her work. Whether it was during trips to the Smithsonian, bike rides, or burning spaghetti in Susan's kitchen, David was perpetually curious. Susan answered what questions she could and gave David the general and classified overview of the National Security Agency. What David heard enthralled him. Founded by President Truman at 12:01 a.m. on November 4, 1952, the NSA had been the most clandestine intelligence agency in the world for almost 50 years. The NSA's 7-page Inception Doctrine laid out a very concise agenda to protect U.S. government communications and to intercept the communications of foreign powers. The roof of the NSA's main operations building was littered with over 500 antennas, including 2 large radomes that looked like enormous golf balls. The building itself was mammoth, over 2 million square feet, twice the size of CIA headquarters. Inside were 8 million feet of telephone wire and 80,000 square feet of permanently sealed windows. Susan told David about COMINT, the agency's Global Reconnaissance Division, a mind-boggling collection of listening posts, satellites, spies, and wiretaps around the globe. Thousands of communiques and conversations were intercepted every day, and they were all sent to the NSA's analysts for decryption. The FBI, CIA, and U.S. foreign policy advisors all depended on the NSA's intelligence to make their decisions. Becker was mesmerized. And code breaking? Where do you fit in? Susan explained how the intercepted transmissions often originated from dangerous governments, hostile factions, and terrorist groups, many of whom were inside U.S. borders. Their communications were usually encoded for secrecy in case they ended up in the wrong hands, which, thanks to COMINT, they usually did. Susan told David her job was to study the codes, break them by hand, and furnish the NSA with the deciphered messages. This was not entirely true. Susan felt a pang of guilt over lying to her new love, but she had no choice. A few years ago it would have been accurate, but things had changed at the NSA. The whole world of cryptography had changed. Susan's new duties were classified even to many in the highest echelons of power. Codes, Becker said, fascinated. How do you know where to start? I mean, how do you break them? Susan smiled. You of all people should know. It's like studying a foreign language. At first, the text looks like gibberish, but as you learn the rules defining its structure, you can start to extract meaning. Becker nodded, impressed. He wanted to know more. With Merletti's napkins and concert programs as her chalkboard, Susan set out to give her charming new pedagogue a mini-course in cryptography. She began with Julius Caesar's perfect square cipher box. Caesar, she explained, was the first code writer in history. When his foot messengers started getting ambushed and his secret communiques stolen, he devised a rudimentary way to encrypt his directives. He rearranged the text of his messages such that the correspondence looked senseless. Of course, it was not. Each message always had a letter count that was a perfect square, 16, 25, 100, depending on how much Caesar needed to say. He secretly informed his officers that when a random message arrived, they should transcribe the text into a square grid. If they did and read top to bottom, a secret message would magically appear. Side note, a more solid or time withstanding way of quote-unquote encrypting directives, in a sense, in probably during one of the world wars, I don't know, a long time ago. Anyway, when a messenger had to leave a message for troops who would be in an area later on, they would they had they had a type of device, and I think for some reason in my mind I remember it looking kind of like a little funnel, like the kind you use in the kitchen, and they would write down whatever message they had to write on paper and put it in the little funnel thing, and then stick it in the ground, and then using a compass they would give the exact longitude and latitude, and then, well, I don't know how they told the people later. Maybe they wrote it on a wall or something in some way. Anyway, then when the troops that needed to know that information, when they showed up at the location later, they would go to that exact latitude and longitude, and then they would pick up the little buried funnel looking thing with a message inside, and then they would have it. So kind of like Caesar's code writing, secret communique, encryption stuff, but not. Maybe for people who aren't like technology nerds or mathematic experts like me. Not a number of people. Anyway. Over time, Caesar's concept of rearranging text was adopted by others and modified to become more difficult to break. The pinnacle of non-computer-based encryption came during World War II. The Nazis built a baffling encryption machine named Enigma. The device resembled an old-fashioned typewriter with brass interlocking rotors that revolved in intricate ways and shuffled clear text into confounding arrays of seemingly senseless character groupings. Only by having another Enigma machine calibrated the exact same way could the recipient break the code. Becker listened, spellbound. The teacher had become the student. One night at a university performance of the Nutcracker, Susan gave David his first basic code to break. He sat through the entire intermission, pen in hand, puzzling over the 11-letter message. HL, fingerspace, FKZC, fingerspace, VD, fingerspace, LDS. Finally, just as the lights dimmed for the second half, he got it. To encode, Susan had simply replaced each letter of her message with the letter preceding it in the alphabet. To decrypt the code, all Becker had to do was shift each letter one space forward in the alphabet. A became B, B became C, and so on. He quickly shifted the remaining letters. He never imagined 4 little syllables could make him so happy. I'm glad we met. He quickly scrawled his response and handed it to her. LD, fingerspace, SNN. Susan read it and beamed. Becker had to laugh. He was 35 years old and his heart was doing backflips. He'd never been so attracted to a woman in his life. Her delicate European features and soft brown eyes reminded him of an ad for Estee Lauder. If Susan's body had been lanky and awkward as a teenager, it sure wasn't now. Somewhere along the way, she had developed a willowy grace, slender and tall, with full, firm breasts and a perfectly flat abdomen. David often joked that she was the first swimsuit model he'd ever met with a doctorate in applied mathematics and number theory. As the months passed, they both started to suspect they'd found something that could last a lifetime. They'd been together almost 2 years when, out of the blue, David proposed to her. It was on a weekend trip to the Smoky Mountains. They were lying on a big canopy bed at Stone Manor. He had no ring, he just blurted it out. That's what she loved about him. He was so spontaneous. She kissed him long and hard. He took her in his arms and slipped off her nightgown. I'll take that as a yes, he said, and they made love all night by the warmth of the fire. The magical evening had been 6 months ago, before David's unexpected promotion to chairman of the modern language department. Their relationship had been in a downhill slide ever since.